quite bright. Alright, so the other day I did one of these kind of as a test, and I apologize for the exposure right now. It's a little bright, and I can see that. It doesn't seem to be much I can do to fix it, but consider this kind of another test. Still kind of getting all the bugs and kinks worked out. But as I'm driving home today, I thought I'd share some of my initial thoughts on the GH5. Since I'm going to be putting together some video content around the GH5, maybe a full review, maybe some more in-depth stuff, but that takes a little bit more time. And I know there's people out there who are eager to learn as much as they can about the camera, so I want to share some of my initial impressions. This is kind of the stuff that, everything take with a grain of salt, because I can't make any definitive statements one way or the other. I got to do a lot more testing before I can do that. But this is kind of the stuff that you could anticipate if you were to buy a GH5 or rent one yourself, kind of maybe a similar mindset or things you might actually encounter when you get one. So kind of to prepare you and kind of set the expectations for what you can kind of expect when you start shooting with the GH5. Now there's been a lot of controversy around the GH5 as of late in regards to the autofocus specifically, so we're going to talk about that. But I should mention that because I'm driving, my priority is focusing on the road, so I'm not going to be looking at chat too much or anything like that, or interacting that way. It's just going to be kind of stream of consciousness, my initial thoughts about the GH5. Obviously, I'm not showing any test footage in here, but don't worry, that will come. I'm shooting a lot of different stuff with the GH5, so that footage will be coming in future videos. And then I should also mention that I'm going to be live streaming again in a couple hours later tonight, an actual conversation, and I'm going to be doing that from my office, so I'll be able to monitor chat. So if you want to come hang out and talk a little bit more about the GH5 with me in a couple hours, be there. I'm going to be streaming as well, probably around 9:30, maybe 10, depending on any technical glitches or issues. So a couple hours from now. Anyway, let's talk about the GH5, and let's start with the autofocus, because that has been the potentially Achilles heel of the GH5, or at least that's what some people will have you think, because it's just so terrible, some might say, or some believe. And then there's other people who say that it's perfectly fine. My initial thoughts on the autofocusing system on the GH5 is that it's not much better than the GH4. It is better. I don't think you can deny that, but I have found it to be remarkably unreliable. So in certain situations, I would say low light, but when some people say low light, they mean like no light. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a situation where there's light, it's just a little bit dimmer, we're not popping like 1Ks or anything super bright, just kind of dim, like, normal like household situation with like, a 50 watt bulb or a 100 watt bulb, that kind of situation. And the GH5 that I was shooting on, because again, there's also variables, what lens are you using, what camera body, it just came out, so there's firmware that they maybe need to optimize a little bit, but all that doesn't really matter. If you pre-order or you're shooting with the camera right now, you want it to work now, not, potentially 3 months from now. So I found that in those conditions of low light, but still adequate light, I would consider adequate light for other cameras, it was having a really hard time, even like moving, even knowing that it needed to focus. And in other situations where I had more light and it was brighter, maybe outside or in a really well-lit space, it was working better. But what I'm finding on the GH5 is that it still does the annoying micro hunting that the GH4 does, where it's constantly checking and going back and forth. And believe me, I've started to test around with the individual autofocus settings, because you can change the speed, the sensitivity. You have some control over those things, but it still seems to be doing the constant adjustments where it's not necessarily going in and out of focus, but it'd be like if you were rack focusing and you always had your hand on the lens and you were constantly fidgeting with it, trying to get it absolutely perfect. And that's not how people pull focus. That's not how you want your focus to look in video. You don't want it constantly hunting. You want it to be smooth. So if it's going from near to far, it goes from near to far and doesn't hit the far and then go da-da-da-da-da-da-da and like kind of vibrate in that like one focal plane, because maybe that's the difference between someone's nose and their eye, their ear and their eye, and that can be really distracting for a viewer to watch. Now this leads to the whole conversation of how important is autofocus for professionals, because even though the GH5 is a consumer camera, a lot of people are looking at it for professional use, and I do not think it is a fair criticism or a fair excuse to say that professionals don't need autofocus. That would be like telling that to a photographer, and you would never do that. Professional photographers use autofocus all the time because the technology has gotten to the point where it works, it's reliable, and you can use it. We're not there yet with video, even with the Sony cameras and the Canon cameras. So I've shot with the 5D Mark IV. I've done a little bit of testing with the C300 Mark II. And that autofocus system works really, really well for video, but it's still not perfect. It's still not to the point where you could trust it 100%. But to get to that point, we have to have the technology advance and then criticize it, say, hey, we need this to be better to meet our expectations and meet our requirements, and they can keep pushing the technology forward. If we say, oh, professionals don't need autofocus, well, then you might as well just say, don't even try and invest in that technology, and I think we need to. Everything that has come to photography makes its way to video. It's just a lot later. When you look at resolution, digital photography started off at like 2 megapixels, really tiny photos, and then they worked their way up to now we've got 50 megapixel photography cameras, and video is kind of on a similar path. It's just delayed a little bit. So we start with SD, and then we go 1080 or 720, and then we go 4K, and now we're seeing stuff like 8K and these really enormous video files in terms of resolution. Same thing with RAW. Digital photography has had RAW for a lot longer, more commonly available and more cheaply available than RAW video. And so I think autofocus, one day we will be looking back at this time and saying, like, why did we even really care or make such a big deal about it? We just needed to adequately criticize it, say this needs to be better, and then that way the camera manufacturers, the engineers can work to actually make it better. So I think it's a very fair criticism to call out the GH5 for having inferior autofocus compared to other cameras. That being said, autofocus should not be the only reason you buy a camera. So if you're looking at the GH5 and you love everything about it, but the autofocus you think is not good enough for your needs, well, then you need to evaluate, do you actually need it? Or is it just something you'd like to have in your back pocket? Because I would think that autofocus for video, it has specific use cases where you want to put the camera on a gimbal. Me, myself, I would love to put the GH5 on the Ronin M and be able to shoot all day long knowing that autofocus is perfect and what I want is going to be in focus. This is really valuable for run and gun shooters, really valuable for like wedding shooters, but there's also like that could be very handy on an independent film or a documentary, a short film, a music video that maybe you have a smaller crew, because that's the other thing. People say, oh, well, professionals would just use a camera assistant to pull focus. No, not necessarily. There are professionals who work on smaller budget productions and they've only got a crew of 3 people. And you may not have someone designated to that role. Maybe you don't have the gear. Maybe, getting a wireless follow focus system is not the most affordable thing to invest in sometimes. So I do understand that there's a use for it, but how often do you need to put a camera on a gimbal and use autofocus? Maybe that's only like 5% of the time you shoot. Well then, okay, rent a Sony camera that does autofocus better, or rent a Canon camera that does autofocus better and use it for that situation. But if you love everything else the GH5 does in terms of the internal codec, having the 10-bit 422 files, 4K 60 is a really great feature to have, so you can actually have some kind of slow motion 4K. I use that all the time. I love to shoot overcranked so I can slow it down in post-production. Even sometimes, for some shots, I'll shoot 30 as like an overcrank and slow it down to 24 just to kind of give it like a slightly dreamier but still real-time look. But being able to shoot 60, being able to shoot 180 frames a second, these are all features that I think in my mind are far more valuable, at least on paper, and I think are far more common features that people would want. The sensor stabilization built right into the camera, that to me is a bigger selling factor than autofocus. But here's where it ultimately may be my, what I think may be the Achilles heel of the GH5 is that the image quality itself is, while it is a step up from the GH4, it is not a significant step up from the GH4. If you get the GH5 and you start shooting out of the box, you dial in all your settings, don't expect to be blown away by like a whole new realm of image quality, because it's very close to the GH4. It is better. I will say that with the Vlog L mode, the shadows are a lot cleaner. So if you've been shooting on the GH4 and you've been frustrated with the noise in Vlog, they did fix that on the GH5. The log mode is a lot cleaner. I don't know if that's any manipulation to the profile itself or if it's just better noise kind of reduction and noise processing. And the dynamic range, this is a conversation probably for a later topic, but we've got, the dynamic range on the GH5 is not significantly improved over the GH4. A little bit. I mean, you could, I kind of have to explain that a little bit more thoroughly there, because there's some ways to think about that a little different. But just know that if you get the GH5 and you start shooting with it right away, just what it looks like, the picture quality is not going to be a significant step up from the GH4. It is better, and it is maybe pleasantly better. Like, it's not frustrating, like, oh, they didn't upgrade it, come on, Panasonic. But it's not like, oh my god, I'm blown away, this is so much better. But all those other features kind of maybe compensate for that, if you want to look at it that way. Basically, from the way I look at it, and I'm not a camera engineer, I don't know all the ins and outs of making and designing a camera, like, they took a GH4 and crammed some more processing power into it in terms of, I'm going to actually, my connection looks kind of poor here. It's probably because I'm in my garage. Let's just back out, maybe re-engage with the satellite. Hopefully that fixes it if there was an issue there. Like I said, still working out the the kinks. So I'll wrap this up because I will be live streaming again in a couple hours. But I think they basically kind of took a GH4, kept the same kind of overall image quality, and just kind of threw some more processing at it to get some more frame rates. Obviously, we got the sensor stabilization, we got a better codec. So there's some things that they've done to beef it up, but it's still not like the difference, I would say, maybe between the GH3 and the GH4, where for me that felt like a significant upgrade. And I know there's a lot of people who love the GH3 and didn't see a reason to go to the GH4, but for me the 4K was a big enough push to get me to do it. But I'd be curious to know if you have any thoughts on it. And again, I'm going to be making more video content around this. So that's kind of a loose ballpark idea of where I'm currently at with the GH5. But we'll have some more conversations. We'll talk a little bit more about it. And I'm going to touch a little bit more on the dynamic range, because there's some different ways you can think about that on the GH5. So hopefully the end of this wasn't just all garbage, because it does say bad connection. So hopefully it wasn't too bad.